Hey guys, this is the lecture video 281 through 293, the lower South and the upper South, kind of setting the scene for what the South is going to look like for the start or the push towards the Civil War, which we'll get to chapter 12 and 13 set up and then into it. The American South has natural advantages to growing anything, but especially cotton. The lower South more so than the upper South. Ambitious white Southerners wanted to exploit that. Why would you not? You want to make the most money as possible. And cotton production and slavery go hand in hand. You got to have slaves in order to pick all the cotton. After 1790s, cotton production boomed. It required this huge, significant labor force. They already have slaves down there, but it's just import more, import more, import more. By 1808, the importation of slaves has been stopped, and they work on breeding slaves more so than anything else. Slaves also cultivated corn and performed other tasks. Large plantations specialized in cash crops, and they are the uber rich. I mean, most people in the South do not own slaves. The people that do own slaves own five or less. It's just the uber wealthy, the huge plantations that own these massive plantations with massive amount of slaves. And they are the leading economic institutions of the lower South. There is no industrialization. There is no urbanization. It's all about the plantation style of life. By 1850, they're specialized even more. They're growing one thing, and that's cotton. Most of them are growing cotton. There's two ways for a plantation to be run. On a cotton plantation, they would use the gang system, or they would be organized a group of 5 to 10 field hands working in teams, and they would work sun up to sundown all day long, run by a slave driver. You may have 4 or 5 teams working in a field doing certain things, and that's why they called it a gang, a group of them together. Most of the time they were working on the same thing, either planting or picking or whatever it may be. The other system was known as the task system, where they were given a specific task. It may take them days, weeks. It may only take them a couple hours. When they were finished with that task, they were done until they got their next task. This went hand in hand with the rice plantation, and so it was like that. And so the task system was much more laid back than the gang system was. So upper South, lower South, you can see here the lower South, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. The upper South, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, all that up there. When we're talking about the border states, the border South, that we're talking up here. When we talk about the lower South, we're talking about here. When we talk about the upper South, we talk about the border states and then the middle states. Okay, so these are the border states: Missouri, Kentucky, Virginia, Delaware, Maryland, and then the middle states, more or less the bottom of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas down here. Okay, so don't get confused with me telling you now there's an upper and a lower. Well, there's also an upper border, an upper middle, and then a lower South. Okay. The profitability of slavery rested on the demand of cotton outside the South, and it grows at an annual rate of 5% for 50 straight years, which is crazy because if you make $50,000, 5% of that is $2,500. So the next year you're making $52,500. Well, then you have 5% of that, and then you have 5% of that, and then you have 5% of that. So you're exponentially growing your wealth. Majority of the stuff outside of the United States is being sent to Britain. Majority of it is being sent to Britain anyways because they have their large textile mills. They go through the Industrial Revolution first before anybody else. These Industrial Revolution happens there because they can turn cotton straight from cotton all the way into clothes. So from cotton into thread into cloth into clothes, all under one roof. And then it'll spread to continental Europe once they start to get it. And then, of course, once America has the capabilities to do the same things that Europe and England have, we don't have to just supply people anymore. Now we can manufacture what we're supplying. Remember back when we had the colonies, when we were a colony, we would supply all the natural resources to Britain. Britain would turn it into finished products. Well, now we can do that all in our own country, which is huge. Southern law defines slaves as chattel. If you look at chattel, it's cattle with an H. I know it's spelled differently, but that's the easy way to remember it. Chattel, human cattle. And the internal slave trade is large and profitable. Again, 1808, slavery ends. Importation of slavery ends. So that you have to worry about either breeding them yourselves or trading with somebody else or buying them from somebody who else has them. The lower South sees, as I said earlier, industrialization and urbanization as threats to slavery. Majority of slaves are working as field hands, but some slaves who are living in cities, because some, Charleston, South Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, these are big cities, and they do have slaves still. They work as artisans if they're super skilled, semi-skilled workers as carpenters or painters or masons or things like that. And then domestics, meaning, they're just working in the house. They're butlers, they're cleaners, they're nannies, whatever it may be. But you have to remember, if you own slaves, you're not going to do anything on your own. You're not going to do anything yourself. You're going to have your slaves do everything for you. This is just a poster from Thomas Griggs, who's basically, from what I've come to research, a broker of slaves. He'll buy your slaves, turn around and sell them somewhere else. Because there's a large profit in that. As I've stated earlier, in previous discussions, slaves in today's money are worth anywhere from $50,000 to $60,000 or more, depending on if they're women in childbearing years or hardworking males. It just all depends. And the price is very close for a woman who could bear a child and a man in his peak years, because men can do more work than women. Typically, again, women can do as much work as men, but y'all follow what I'm saying. But women can bear children, which is huge. So you need to have all those slaves on your all those types of slaves on your plantation. The Upper South is experiencing some big bad issues. They have exhausted their fields. They have depopulation where people are moving to the south or to the north. It's just not as plentiful in the Upper South as they thought it would be. As you read in your book, hopefully, Edmund Ruffin had a whole bunch of different ideas. He promoted effective means of soil fertilization, cultivation, crop diversification, and he helped revive the economy. Dig deeper in the soil, turn it over, get more nutrients, plant other things besides corn and cotton and wheat, and plant things that are going to be nutrients to the soil and things of that nature. Urbanization starts to trickle down from the north. So if we go back to this slide right here, you have tons of urbanization up in the north. You have zero urbanization and industrialization in the south. But as you start coming down from the north, when we're talking about the Upper South, these areas have more urbanization than these areas. These areas have more urbanization than these areas, and so on and so forth. So it's that trickle down as it's coming down. Slowly but surely, urbanization and industrialization is happening. The Lower South is pushing that away, but as you can tell from the lecture, the farther it's moving down south, the less urbanization and industrialization there is. All right, here's where things are grown. You can see the areas that, of course, cotton is king. You see sugarcane being grown in Louisiana, and rice grown specifically in South Carolina and a little bit in Georgia. You see tobacco grown in North Carolina and Virginia and Kentucky and Tennessee. Corn is king in really western and eastern Tennessee, but really Missouri. No, they're not growing marijuana. They're growing hemp. So don't get any ideas there. Rye, they're growing that as a grain, but also to use for bread and things of that nature, but also to use to distill in whiskey. And that's the real reason why Tennessee is growing theirs as well, as to turn into bourbon. But as we move along, you can see the different areas in the Upper South and the Lower South that are growing things. And you can see, for the most part, in the Lower South, it's basically cotton. In the border South, the decline of slavery is most evident, and we're going to see a chart here where it's going to show that. Other areas of the Upper South, slavery growth is evident. Uh, Only in Arkansas, though, and that's really, and let's go here. Let's go this way this time. You can see like here, and I guess I should have went this way. I'm sorry. You can see here just the Delta region, really the south eastern region, and even the middle of Arkansas is growing cotton. That's where slaves are going to be. All these other regions up here, they're not going to grow. They're not going to grow cotton, so there's no need for slaves. The Upper South acted as a slave exporter to the Lower South, accelerating the decline of slavery in the upper region. Again, it's just dropping slaves down. Just as industrialization and urbanization is trickling down, slaves are being traded down even further. Crop diversification in the Upper South with corn and rye and tobacco and everything else contributes to the decline of slavery. Plus, more people are moving there, so labor's cheap. So, sell your slave for, peak dollars. And if you sell all your slaves, you have enough money to pay people to work for you for a long period of time. And this is the chart I was telling you about, how the Lower South is booming with slaves, whereas the Upper South middle states and the Upper South border states, those areas I told you about earlier, are losing slaves. They're roughly in a 60-year period, they almost lose half of their slaves as far as percentage of slaves go in the United States. Slave codes were passed by each southern state, and that defined the status of slaves and the rights of the master, and the master can get away with doing pretty much anything they want. Planters provided slaves with the bare necessities, the three things: food and water, shelter, and clothing. Food was inadequate. You could get enough calories, but you're basically eating cornmeal and the parts of a pig or whatever animal that the slave owner butchers that they don't want. So not great food. Maybe a few vegetables here and there if some vegetables spoil, and some of the slaves can get some spoiled vegetables. Clothing. Sorry about that. Clothing wise, you have a set of work clothes, a set of non-work clothes, and it says they lived in small cabins. I mean, a cabin, I guess, if it's 4 walls and a roof, it's not much. You could have a canvas style roof, like a tent almost over you, with some walls. I mean, it was the bare essentials, the bare minimum. Slaves worked from sun up to sundown, and about 75% of all slaves are field hands. Majority of the other ones may work in the home or things like that, but slaves are there to do the hard labor. You may have your oldest female be your cook and take care of the children or things of that nature and clean. You may have your oldest male doing the, quote unquote yard work, cutting grass, cutting bushes, doing things in the home, things of that nature. You could have younger women also, raising the children too. It just all depended. Here is a picture of a younger woman who's raising a white child. The white children and the slave children would be raised together up until a certain point where they would be separated, and that hatred instilled to the white people, the slave owners' children. But you were raised. As a child, you loved, who raised you. This was an African American woman. The family is the core institution of slave life, and 2/3 of all slave families have both parents. Although the fear of being sold or things of that nature are very common, they try to stick together and build lasting relationships, but it's difficult because at any moment things could change. Slave religion is based on African traditions, and no more than 30% of slaves converted to Christianity. This painting shows how a slave owner could take advantage of a slave, consensually or non-consensually, sexually, raping them, or Thomas Jefferson had a slave wife, who he treated differently than any of the other slaves, but also, a slave owner beating his slave. I mean, it's just in one painting pretty non-ideal. It just shows what had to happen in the life of a slave owner and slave in the South. That's all I got for you. This is the lecture video 281 through 293.